You got it? Now, you race car guys probably know exactly what I'm talking about, or anybody that's ever used AN fittings. They're amazing until they won't line up. Maybe you're fighting the hose or you're fighting a part that isn't aligned and you can't get the threads to engage the way they're supposed to, and it will drive you crazy. Sometimes you'll even mess up a fitting and mar the threads. Well, I've had that happen plenty of times on the 308, and today we're going to make sure it never happens again because we are replumbing the entire oil system, and we're going to be using Dyno's push-to-connect pro-spec fittings. I'm never going to need a wrench again. I'm excited to show you guys how these work. This is probably one of the coolest upgrades I have done to this thing so far. And look at it. How sick is that? Let's plumb this thing. I'll show you how it works. This is going to be amazing. In one of our latest episodes, we got our new K20 dropped into the car, and with it, we've made revisions to the fuel system. With 2 new fuel pumps and a surge tank, it requires a lot of new plumbing to make it work. And on top of that, because we blew up our previous K24, I want to replace all of the oil lines to make sure there are no contaminants in the system. To help with that, we've got Brendan McGrath of Dyno PSI. He's a diehard enthusiast just like you and I, and he also knows a thing or two about plumbing. He's here today to help us improve the fluid systems on the Ferrari, and in more ways than one. Not only can we simplify the plumbing and make it more straightforward to use and service, we can also improve the durability, quality, and reliability of the hoses, and we can trim weight while we're at it. We're going to be using Dyno's Superleggera hose for this job. It's a lightweight PTFE or Teflon lined hose that's wrapped in Kevlar for extra strength. In order to build these hoses, we're going to use Dyno's rattlesnake toolkit so that we can build these at the correct length and the correct clocking the first time efficiently and effectively. All right, let me tell you how the rattlesnake kit actually works. What we've got are a bunch of plastic interlocking pieces that represent AN hose. It's the correct size, and it also represents the correct amount that you should be able to articulate the hose so you know how much kind of bend you're playing with. Real hose will move a little bit more, but it's a good rule of thumb. Now, what's really cool about this system is it comes with more or less every possible fitting you could need. So in our case, let's say we want to use a 90-degree fitting on one end. We pick a 90-degree fitting out, we lock it into place, and let's say we want a straight fitting on the other. Pretty standard setup. They lock together, and now we have what represents an AN hose, and this tells us exactly how long the hose has to be. We can mock this up in the car, we can use it to test fit, and then we can ultimately use it so that we can make the hose exactly how it's supposed to be. And what's cool is the pieces come apart, you can change the length, you can set it all up, we can make it long, short, however you want. It basically is a modular system. Now, what's also pretty cool is that because the fittings that this uses are crimp style fittings, they get crimped in a machine, they actually have this clocking device that allows us to set the hose up and figure out exactly how many degrees we're going to offset everything. And if you look really closely, if I set this back to 0, these pieces have what we can call a spine on them. There's kind of an indexing line on all of the pieces, and that tells us in this orientation that we are at 0 degrees. The hose fittings would be clocked at nothing. But let's say we want to kind of twist them because they're not swivel fittings. Well, this allows us to see exactly how many degrees we clock each fitting on the hose, lock it down once it's in the car, and that would tell us exactly where it needs to be, which doesn't make a ton of sense on a straight fitting, but let's say it has different angles. And we can add all the pieces that we want. It's a really cool system. We've kind of been using this for a minute now. You guys haven't seen it yet, but this has made making these hoses insanely easy. We're just flying through them. Now let's be clear. This tool is certainly not required, and most people that have built AN lines know this. But they have also had to feed an entire roll of AN hose through part of their car just to make sure they get the hose fitment just right, and this is a much better alternative. More importantly, though, there's no guessing game involved with what fittings you might need. I can't count how many times over the years I've stared at the back of my car trying to make a list of every fitting I might need in order to finish a project. From 30s, 60s, 90s, 180s, how many of each, how many feet of each hose I might want. And then, of course, the delays that happen once you realize you guessed wrong and you need that one extra 90 and have to wait for it to come in. The rattlesnake toolkit eliminates that completely. Does that mean this is for hobbyists? No. Most guys aren't going to need something like this, but if you're like me and love to build race cars one after the other, or maybe you've got a shop of your own, this is an incredible tool to have in your tool set. Now, while I could talk about tools all day, someone's going to complain that this sounds more like an ad, so let's move on to the plumbing job at hand. We need to build a supply line from the in-tank pump to the surge tank. We need to go from the 2 pumps in the surge tank to the filter and then to the fuel rail. We need to go from the fuel rail to our fuel pressure regulator, out of the regulator, back to the surge tank, and then from the surge tank back to the return on the cell itself. That's 7 lines in total, each of them -8 in size. It took maybe an hour and a half in order to get all of the lines measured up, figure out exactly what fittings we need, and get everything notated so we could build the lines appropriately. All right, now that we're done with the fuel system, we're going to move on to the oil system, and that's where these Pro Spec connectors are going to come into play. We could have used them on the fuel system, but it's not really needed. There's only 2 fittings that I need to remove from the engine in order to pull the engine out when it comes to fuel. But oil, there's a lot of lines because we have a dry sump system, and I want to make sure that if I ever have to pull this engine out at the track again, or just next time it has to come out here in the shop, I want to make my life easy. So we're going to use these where we can. Now, if you're wondering how they work, it's really simple. Think of it exactly the same as kind of an air compressor airline fitting. It's just a simple push to connect, and then when you want to remove it, you pull the collar back and pull it off. And believe it or not, this has some, 10,000 PSI rating. It's absolutely massive. It swivels and pivots anywhere you need to go. It's way more misalignment friendly than normal threads. I mean, it doesn't get cooler than this. It's kind of like a Wiggins clamp, but not hundreds of dollars per fitting. This is totally normal stuff that's attainable for guys like you and me. This is going to change the game for actually working on this car, and as I've said, that's part of what goes into building a car, making sure that we can service it, and because I already know I'm going to break it again. At some point, I'm going to really hurt this thing, trying to push it to the limit, and this is going to make my life easier next time this engine has to come out. So let's get these fittings in place. We're going to measure up some hoses and get it all replumbed. To begin, we've got to get the car up in the air because unlike the fuel lines, most of the oil system is underneath the car. It's all related to our dry sump system. Unlike a normal car with a wet sump oil pan, our oil pump is external to the engine, and thus all of our oil circulates outside of the engine as well. With things like an external oil tank and filter, it can bring up some interesting puzzles to solve. So the packaging constraints, because some idiot swapped this engine into this car without planning 1,000 steps ahead, is that the water pump kind of interferes with some of the plumbing routing for the oil supply to the dry sump pump. The way that I had it working before was just kind of snaking a hose right around, but to say that it cleared by just a hair is an understatement because the fitting clearly was smacking into the fuel cell as the engine moved around. So there was really not enough clearance for that setup. What we're trying to do now is come up with an alternative so I don't have that same problem again. But we want to be careful because we're talking about the oil supply line from the tank for the engine, for the pump. And so if we have some sort of issue in that line, if we airlock it somehow, if we create a cavity, then we starve the engine of oil and we wind up right back here, and we don't want that. For the most part, though, it seems like the rest of our oil lines can all stay loosely as they were before. We can reroute them for a bit better efficiency, but as a whole, everything worked well, and we don't want to try to reinvent the wheel. As it stands, it's Tuesday the 17th, so we've only got 8 full days before we need to hit the road for GRIDLIFE Laguna Seca, so we need to minimize potential issues and figure out any remaining variables. Oh, I need to call Rob at Track Tough and have him come make that filler neck. Rob, if you're watching this, I'm sorry I haven't called you yet, and I'm going to be that guy that calls you at the last second and says, I need you to come solve an issue for me. So this is your primer because I'm going to forget to call you between now and when this video comes out. It's a kind of double whammy of my poor planning being your emergency, and I appreciate your help. To figure out the routing of our oil lines, we wanted to make sure all of the components that were pulled out of the engine bay were finally mounted back into place. We don't want to try to install a large Dash 12 fitting for oil flow only to find out that it's not going to fit once everything else goes in. It's also a good time for us to figure out where we can use these Pro Spec quick disconnect fittings because we don't have an unlimited number of them. In fact, they're not even available yet. They're going to come out sometime around SEMA in November. But for now, we want to use the ones that we do have in beneficial places, where I know if I want to disconnect a line for a purposeful reason, it's easy to do without tools. Later down the line, honestly, I'd like to replace most of our fittings with these quick disconnects, but for now, I'll have to settle. Now, one other kind of cool aspect to these Pro Spec connectors is the fact that, of course, once we unhook a hose, if I were to pull our oil line off of this, we're going to have oil coming out of both of these. It's just going to be pouring out, and I don't want that. But they also make plugs that go onto each end of this system, pops into place, keeps all of our fluid from coming out so we can minimize the mess and just focus on pulling the engine, and I think that's pretty trick. So while Brendan took off and went back to his shop to crimp all of our hoses with his equipment, I got back to work putting the rest of the car back together. In our last episode, we got things like the exhaust and charge piping done, so now it's time to reinstall the axles, which unfortunately is no small task. A lot of the suspension's got to come off in order to get them into place. There's all sorts of other small tidbits we've got to knock out as well, such as installing our new TurboSmart oil pressure regulator, but honestly, this is all stuff on a list that we're going to be crossing off over the next handful of days. The next morning, Brendan showed up with all of our hoses crimped and ready to install. I'll be honest, I wish I had weighed all of the hosing in one go, both what came off the car and what's going in, but to say we're dropping a lot of weight here is an understatement. We're getting rid of pounds worth of rubber and stainless steel in favor of this Teflon and Kevlar. We're also going to get a bit more flow out of these lines because the inner diameter is bigger than your typical rubber hose. Does that really matter? In most cases, no, but when we're really leaning on a tiny 2-liter engine to make a whole bunch of power, we want to make sure we remove any potential restrictions or failure points, such as bad oil flow. We're going to add a few more sensors to the engine this time around as well, one of them being a sensor to monitor engine crankcase vacuum or pressure. Because we're dry sump, the crankcase should always be under vacuum, but we want to make sure that amount of vacuum is just right, and we're going to use a regulator on the outside of the valve cover to keep it in check. I think it's also a good idea for us to add a coolant pressure sensor so that we know if we've got a cooling problem or if we blow a head gasket. Getting some of these dry sump lines from the pump to the tank installed previously was an absolute nightmare, just due to getting fittings aligned and their overall lengths, but this time it was a breeze, and while I'm hoping I don't have to pull this stuff apart anytime soon, if I have to, it's going to take way less time to do. With all that said, our plumbing is officially done, all of our hoses are installed, we can fill this thing up with fluids. I wouldn't be promoting or supporting a product that I didn't truly believe in, and in this case, I am stoked to have these Dyno hoses on the 308. Okay, now my plan is first to figure out where I put the little drill. I think it's over here, but you guys can't peek. Blinders. Okay. Now we're going to take the drill, and because we're dry sump, the goal is to build oil pressure without ever even turning the engine over. We can just pull the belt off of the dry sump pump, spin it with the drill, and build oil pressure, make sure that all the lines aren't leaking, that I got everything tight, and then also just get oil circulating through the engine without ever actually having to run it, which is good given this one has never run before. So we're going to use a drill instead of an impact, just so that we're not kind of hammering on the pump itself. That wouldn't be good for it. We'll start out slow, and then turn it up a little bit and see where we stand. I can hear oil circulating. I don't see any dripping out anywhere. So it's got good resistance on it. It's a good sign. No oil coming out. Here in a moment we'll turn the dash on, do that again, and just see what the oil pressure is, but should be good. All right. transmission, fuel, start it. We don't have a long list to get through, but it's not a short one either. But thankfully, most of it I've got a game plan for and we can knock out efficiently. Most of it is just reinstalling components like our water-to-air intercooler or filling systems and then bleeding them, from coolant to the clutch. The only annoying one is filling up our transmission. The fill port is blocked by pretty much everything in the engine bay, so the only way to get fluid into it is to pull the breather line and fill it through that. To get 2.5 liters in it through this method is arduously slow, but eventually we got there. Bleeding the clutch was a two-man job, but everything else was simple to knock out, and I got it all crossed off within the afternoon. The last thing on the list was to wire in the new surge tank fuel pumps, which was easy thanks to the fact that Ryan over at Rywire built me a jumper harness, we plugged it in, and just had to program it on the Nexus R5. Andrew Molina at Animal Auto walked me through the process, and within a handful of minutes, we were basically ready to test everything. As you saw, we've circulated oil through our brand new engine, and we made the necessary changes for an initial startup. Last but not least, let's test the fuel system itself and make sure there are no leaks. As someone who's had a garage fire in the past, I take this step very seriously, including making sure I know where all of the fire extinguishers are at any given moment. A first startup is always inherently risky, and I want to take this one slow and steady. Thankfully, everything checks out, we're looking really good, and it's holding good fuel pressure, so let's take the next steps. So the entirety of the new fuel system, which is our old fuel pump plus our 2 new surge pumps, and all our plumbing are clearly working correctly. We don't have any leaks, and we're just sitting at a static 54 psi, which I think is where we had it set before, so that looks good. We've got them all wired in. They're now controlled by our can pad up in the front. We still need to set up the rear one. I haven't done that yet, so we're not using it right now, but everything looks good. I think we are ready to fire it. I'm going to check oil pressure one more time and then put the belt on because we don't want to run it without the belt. It doesn't yet, because it doesn't run yet, because I haven't charged this battery, because it's been a full year since this car has run. But now we got the thing, the juice maker on it. Here we go. Well, it was doing this before. Why? You got it. Seems reasonably happy. That feels pretty good. It lives again. A little rough on the idle, but it's just the tune from the K24, like nothing changed, so that's to be expected. It sounds good. The turbo is loud.
It is quite loud. That
thing sounds sick. I don't know if you guys get to hear that, but it's whistling. It sounds awesome. I'm excited to actually like rev it up. It's going to sound nuts. Any leaks or anything?
No, no drips.
No drips. Ladies and gentlemen, it lives. All right, now to put it the rest of the way back together and go to the dyno in 12 hours. Yeah, we need to leave here 13 hours. Should be fine. Honestly, as far as putting it the rest of the way back together, I think it's put wheels on it, make sure it shifts, pull all the tools off of it, because it should be good to go. And so after another hour or two of putting on the finishing touches, it's time to take the car to the dyno. I'm not one to pull the car in the trailer ahead of time because with my luck, overnight somebody would run away with my truck, trailer, and Ferrari, and I'd rather that not be the case. So we'll load it up first thing in the morning and head over to Animal Auto where Andrew Molina will work his magic as always. If all goes well, that'll use up our Friday, but that leaves Saturday, Sunday, and then Monday through Wednesday for any further testing, any changes that we want to make, any revisions, or just any fixes along the way. It'll take the day on Thursday to make our way up to Monterey where Laguna Seca is, and of course the event starts on Friday. So the clock is ticking, but right now, I wouldn't say we're ahead of schedule, but we're doing fine. I wish we had the chance to get out and test at Buttonwillow before heading north, but sometimes you just don't get what you want. And for those that are going to complain and say, well, you're rushing and you should test beforehand, any driving on track is really just a test, so let's go test somewhere really fun. However, things are not going all that smoothly. It is currently, as we record this, 48 hours until we need to leave for Laguna Seca. It's Tuesday afternoon. Things are going to get crazy in the next episode. It's going to be one worth watching. Everybody on Patreon and on Discord already knows what's going on, and we've got our work cut out for us, but we're going to make it. We're going to see you guys at Laguna Seca. No matter what, we will be there, and we will catch you guys in the next episode. Hit the Patreon if you want to know what's going on behind the scenes. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.